this back in Psalm 125. We saw it again in 128. And here it is once again in Psalm 130. O Israel, put your hope in the Lord, for with the Lord is unfailing love. Redeemed sinners are prone to tell other people, to tell other sinners, right, about their redemption and the goodness of it and the need of it. This psalm ends with a reference to the unfailing love of God, the fact that with our Lord there is full redemption, and then this promise that He Himself will redeem Israel from all their sins, which makes being a member of Israel, being a part of the kingdom of Christ, being in good standing with God, absolutely vital and our ultimate value. Comments, questions, things that you notice or want to ask about regarding Psalm number 130? Yes?
Verse 6,
Mm-hmm.
the repetition.
Mm-hmm.
Comment on that?
Poets sometimes do this. The question is, what's happening in verse number 6 where we get that refrain? And kind of helps. One comment I would have is, this wasn't the last poet to do this, right? So you get in Robert Frost, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. What's the emphasis there? Well, that poem ends like that. This poem is not over. I'm not sure. More than watchmen wait for the morning. What's the significance of watchmen waiting for the morning? If you're a watchman and the enemy could come over the horizon in the middle of the night, you may or may not see them. If you're on duty and you're guarding a city, there's nothing you love more, right, than sunrise. Because when sunrise rolls around, now all of a sudden, what you're looking for, right, is going to be much more obvious. So there's kind of like this is the kind of relief that sinners get or receive from God, is this relief that someone then experiences whenever the sun comes over the horizon, and at least for that day, right, the city is no longer exposed to danger. The waiting is the hard part, right, and then once you get relief, once the response comes, that breaks up that waiting. Sure, it kind of spells out, it kind of mimics the experience of waiting, because you have to wait through that phrase a second time. So it kind of gets drawn out. Mm-hmm. Trying to stay awake can be absolutely miserable. So being sleep deprived, whether someone else is doing it or whether you're doing it to yourself, great point, right? So the watchman who's made it through the night, the sun comes up, now that guy gets to go to bed, right? Good point. Great comments, observations. Something else or someone else on any of this? Sure, you have to dwell on it for a minute, and that's a great kind of poet's device there, that the poets.
Similar to what Paul has done.
Mm-hmm.
He would say the same phrase twice.
Sure.
To emphasize that particular point.
Yeah, that's a good thing for preachers to do from time to time, isn't it?
I hear that.
Yeah.
I hear that.
Maximal redundancy. Yeah. Great observations, good comments. Appreciate that. Anything else?
Parents repeat themselves too.
What's that?
I said parents and grandparents repeat themselves too.
Parents and grandparents repeat themselves. So there are all kinds of situations in life that where saying something a second time is a good idea. Great point. 131. This is one of the shortest of the songs of ascent. It'll be over before we know it, 3 verses. My heart is not proud, O Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me. But I have stilled and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, put your hope in the Lord, both now and forevermore. Okay, question. Is the beginning of this psalm sort of a license for believers to ignore and dismiss the challenges and the hard questions of life? I'll repeat the question. Is the first part of Psalm 131 an invitation, a license for God's people to ignore the hard questions and dismiss the real challenges, hard thinking, tough doing in life, and just be like a kid? In other words, is the first part of Psalm 131, is it encouraging the idea of ignorance is bliss, and I'll just let the world go by? What's being said here?
King of Israel saying this, since David is the one writing this one, I don't think he's saying, just don't think about important stuff.
I don't either.
Think about important stuff every minute of every day.
This guy's been a king. He's been a warrior. He's been a military leader. I mean, he knows exactly what it means to face up to challenges and to be the first person to say, okay, this is what we ought to do, this is what we shouldn't do, this sort of thing. So to the extent that there's a connection here to David, if David's the author, or it's kind of in the tradition of David's life and thinking, the point is, clearly, David's own life experience and his biography suggests that no. So one of the best observations that I read about this, again, one of my favorite commentators on the book of Psalms, a British scholar by the name of Derek Kidner. And one of the things that Kidner said was, if you take a look at what the psalmist, just in verse 1, says that he has already overcome for the moment, are pride and haughtiness, or high-handedness. Okay? Those are two besetting and tough, difficult sins to overcome. So this is not childishness, is it? This is not child's play. I mean, think about pride. I guess one definition of pride would be undervaluing the thoughts and the feelings of other people. And high-handedness, or being haughty, would be sort of overvaluing the thoughts and feelings of you, your own thoughts and feelings. Right? So these have to do with sins that involve our relationship to other people. You might say, well, it starts out with a disposition towards God that is incorrect or skewed, and I would agree with that. But usually when pride manifests itself, it impacts the people around you. And when high-handedness, haughtiness, it's got a look, right? It's got a tone to it, and we've all experienced that, and hopefully not too often from the sending side, the sending end of those kinds of exchanges. And the psalmist here says, these are things that I, at least for the moment, I've dealt with this. I'm not proud. I'm not haughty and high-handed. Now, the next part, I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful. I mean, are there things that are too wonderful for us to comprehend? Are there things that are beyond us? Are God's ways higher than our ways? Are God's thoughts higher than our thoughts? Well, of course, to ask is to answer. Of course. And so the psalmist says, because I'm not proud, because I know my place, because I don't express myself in a haughty or high-handed way, therefore, kind of intellectually, just what I pay attention to, what I give my time and attention to, I don't waste my time. I don't expend energy unnecessarily, kind of delving into things that are just really beyond me.
My translation says, I don't do great things and I can't do miracles.
Okay, and which translation is that?
It's Max Lucado.
Okay, Max Lucado's translation of this says, I can't do great things and I can't perform miracles, or something close to that. Great expression. I think that's a pretty good paraphrased way of thinking about what the psalm, like, I understand my limits. And it's important to know what we can do and what we should do. It's also important to be aware of what God doesn't expect us to do, and we shouldn't expect of ourselves either. But I have stilled, verse number 2, and quieted my soul like a weaned child. In other words, this is a child that's old enough to kind of, sit up next to mama and be quiet. We're not talking about a squally, colicky baby. That's a different matter. This is a weaned child, right? Child, and thankfully we at least have some weaned children that behave pretty well, and so the author here compares self to that kind of child. Maybe one of the best ways to distinguish what's going on in Psalm 131 and what this psalm is not saying is to ask the question, is there a difference between childish and childlike? Right? Okay, childish, right? But childlike. And as soon as I say that, of course, I'm going to Matthew chapter 18. And you remember this story well. Matthew 18, about the first 4 verses. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Now, back when Muhammad Ali was a cultural icon and Marvin Phillips was still preaching, when this question would come up, Marvin Phillips would say, they're going to have the Muhammad Ali discussion, because Ali would always, "I'm the greatest of all time," which was kind of funny. He was half joking, he was half serious. And so they're having the Muhammad Ali discussion. Who's the greatest? And so Jesus answers by first acting, verse number 2. He called a little child to him and placed the child among them. This is an interesting picture. Where's the child's parents? What does the child think? What is the child doing? Looking around. And verse number 3, he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Quite a statement. Verse 4, "Therefore whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." Is there a difference between childish and childlike? The illustration, right? The example here is childlike. He's not childish. There might be times he acts childishly, but in this context, he's being held up as an example, or looked at as an example, because he is childlike, not childish. And Jesus says, that's what you've got to do. Right? This is who you and I need to become. And I think that's the point that's being made, or what's being expressed in this psalm. And the calmness, right? Just kind of think back to times in your life when you were with dad, or you were with mom, or you were with mom and dad, and everything was just okay, right? Everything was right with the world. And the author seems to say, under these circumstances, in this moment, that's what I've got. I've dealt with pride. I've dealt with high-handedness. I'm not into that, and I'm not into overestimating my abilities or what I can know, what I can do, and therefore there is peace. And again, at the very end of the psalm, then this becomes the command and the hope and the wish for all the people of God. O Israel, put your hope in the Lord both now and forevermore. Great little psalm. What a gem. Something else about Psalm 131, or something you want to notice or mention or ask about? Or yes?
Seems to me that last verse,
Mm-hmm.
together the first part,
Mm-hmm.
that the only way we can avoid
Mm-hmm.
is when we trust in God.
That's right.
And it's not us that accomplishes that, it is He.
Okay, so the God-centeredness of this psalm and the psalms in general, it expresses a disposition, right? There's kind of a mindset that we walk through in life, and that helps to keep us centered and keep us from falling prey to these besetting sins that are referred to in psalms like this one. Good. Did I see another hand, or was there another comment? These are great observations. I appreciate you all chiming in like this. I told you 4 or 5 weeks ago that of these relatively very brief psalms, there was one exception, and that is Psalm 132. And we're going to skip it. I started to dive right into it, and we're going to skip it. So in your further study of the songs of ascents, you've got at least a couple that you'll be looking at, 132, and then the very last of them is 134, and I don't think we're going to get there. I want to look at 133. How am I fixed for time? What time is it? Thank you. So a few more minutes. Let's take a look at Psalm number 133, because I want to tell you a T.B. Larimore story. All right, so eventually, no matter how long if I study the Bible for very long, we're going into Restoration history, okay? So 133 is a great tie-in to one of my favorite characters in the history of the Restoration movement, T.B. Larimore. And this was one of his commentary or his sermons on this psalm were one of the more memorable parts of his preaching. Psalm 133. Again, we've got this connection to David, a song of ascents of David. And again, we have to remember the context of the songs of ascents. These are pilgrim psalms, presumably sung, chanted by memory by people who are on their way to Jerusalem for either the Feast of the Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, or later in the fall, the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths. And so one of the experiences that people would have had in that moment is they would have seen more people than they'd ever seen in a long time together, right? Tens of thousands of people gathered together in the city of Jerusalem, all for the same purpose, and they're there to participate in the feast. And maybe you've been to a very, very large gathering of Christian people, and you've heard them singing and in other ways participating. So whether you go to an encampment, or you've been to a jubilee or a conference or whatever the case might be, and there's these plenary sessions where, again, thousands of people are gathered together. And those are memorable moments. They do something to you. Right? They do your heart good. And the thing that's really neat to reflect on in those moments is just to think that basically everyone here is here for the same reason. We all love Christ. We all want to serve God. We're all interested in learning from the Word of God. We're all interested in praise and worship. Everybody here is for that. For all the variety in the group, there is this unity. Right? There's this oneness. There's this commonality of all these people here. It's just really exciting. And I think those moments are what the psalmist is thinking about in 133. Behold how good and how pleasant it is when brothers live together in unity. It is like precious oil poured on the head, running down on the beard, running down on Aaron's beard, down upon the collar of his robes. It is as if the dew of Hermon were falling on Mount Zion, for there the Lord bestows his blessing, even life forevermore. Again, a reference to Zion, the hill on which the temple in Jerusalem was built. So there's a certain time and a certain place, and the people of God are gathered at that time in that place. And there's this reflection on how good, how pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity. One of the finest preachers of several generations gone by was T.B. Larimore. He was born in 1843 and died in 1929. Not exactly sure. I suspect it was because he did not want to pick up arms. He did as a young man. Again, he's born in 1843. So at the outbreak of war in 1861, that's the year he turned 18 years old. He was a scout in the Confederate Army, captured, and was able to return home after swearing an oath that he would have nothing to do with the CSA Army any longer. And that's what he did. After he was captured and made his pledge, he kind of went home, and that was the end of his war service. I don't believe he ever picked up a weapon or fired a shot in the Civil War. Died out in California, his adopted home, in 1929. For many years before that, he founded and conducted a Christian school, an academy in northern Alabama, and it was the Mars Hill Academy. So think about the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 17 on Mars Hill, and here the Apostle Paul is preaching the gospel to the great philosophers of the day, kind of taking on the ideas and the speculations and the philosophy of the world. It encounters the gospel of Christ at Mars Hill. I think that must have been part of the idea for the naming of that place. He died in 1929, just before, not long before the stock market crash of that year. To give you an idea of just the kind of man, he was tall, had beautiful dark hair. He was kind of bespectacled. And although he was a preacher among the churches of Christ, when you looked at him, you knew this guy was a preacher because he always wore this really, really completely starched white collar. So he sort of looked like someone who belonged in the class of clergy. And I mean, he was just always immaculately dressed, and he always wore that high white collar, which kind of made him look like a preacher. But one of the things he did, let me tell you about something that happened in 1894. By 1894, Larimore had already adopted the practice of, when he would conduct what we call gospel meetings, or what they used to call protracted meeting. It was a series of meetings that was protracted, right? It was going to be elongated. And whenever he would go and conduct a gospel meeting, he would not stop preaching until both either he or the leadership of the congregation that was hosting that meeting had decided this is no longer doing any good. But as long as he was convinced and they were convinced, everyone was agreed that some good was being done, he would keep preaching. Well, he gets to Sherman, Texas in January of 1894 and starts a gospel meeting that continues on until June 7th of that year. Starts on January the 4th, 1894, and continues until June 7th. During his meetings, what Larimore would always do is he would preach once in the morning and once in the evening, 3 times on Sunday. So that's 15 sermons a week from January the 4th to June the 7th of 1894. During those 5 months and by the way, to this day, right, Sherman, Texas, you have a high concentration of congregations of the Church of Christ, lots of members of our people in that place, and a lot of that goes back to this moment. 254 people baptized into Christ, and dozens, scores of others who are renewing their allegiance to Christ. David Lipscomb in Nashville, editor of the Gospel Advocate, wrote to Larimore. He was like, Lipscomb himself was a preacher and a writer and quite a wordsmith, and his question was, how in the world is this guy doing this? And he couldn't fathom how he was doing it. Larimore writes back and says, well, as I prepare every day to preach once again, I consult 3 books. The Bible, the dictionary, the Bible. That's how I study. Larimore had a lot of phrases that he would use frequently in sermons. One of them was, I would be ashamed to be afraid and afraid to be ashamed to say, and something like that. One of his favorite passages was Psalm 133, verse 1, behold how good and pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity. he would quote that and then make this observation. You know, there are many things that are good, but that are not pleasant. For example, an operation that removes a cancerous growth is life-saving. That's good, but it's not pleasant. Other things are pleasant, but not good. For most of us, eating pie or cake, candy, ice cream, pleasant. Not necessarily good. And if you ate nothing but sweets, that certainly would not be good, even though it might be pleasant. Very few things in this world are both good and pleasant. Things that actually benefit you and provide a pleasant experience as well. One of those things is the unity, the oneness of God's people. Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity. What a great thought. Thanks for your studying with me in these last 5 weeks in the Psalms of Ascent. I hope it's been a blessing for you. It has been for me. And we'll start a new series, a new set of lessons, and getting the opportunity to study with Brett next week.